Hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's stay-at-home lecture presentation. I'm Tim Nutt, the Director of the Historical Research Center at UAMS. Glad to have you here tonight. And for those of you who are new to this, coming to these presentations, welcome. I think this is about our 34th or 35th presentation in this series. We started it in the beginning of the pandemic in 2020, and we have continued it throughout, and it will continue to be presented in the future as well. As you may or may not know, if you're new to the series, this is the lecture series that's sponsored by the Society for the History of Medicine and Health Professions, which is an organization, the Friends organization that is that helps the Historical Research Center. And they do that through a number of ways, not only through the sponsor of programming like this, they also sponsor a annual dinner with a lecture associated with that. We have not been able to have that annual dinner for the past couple of years because of the pandemic, but we're hoping, and we are planning, if everything goes well, to start that back up in April of next year and have the annual dinner again starting up. The society, if you're not a member, we'd love to have you join. The dues are inexpensive, $5 for students. You do not have to be a student at UAMS or a medical student at all to join. You can be a high school student, you can be a student at any of the universities in Arkansas or around the country. And for individuals, it's $15. For students, it's $5. You get access to presentations like this. You'll get an invitation to the dinner that we'll be having in April, and other events that we have throughout the year. The Historical Research Center, as I mentioned, is the entity that is supported by the Society for the History of Medicine and Health Professions, and it is the archival division, the archives of the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences. So in that regard, we're medical archives. We do not do things like patient records or anything like that, but we do preserve the history of UAMS, preserve the history of medical education in Arkansas, but also just the general history of medicine and health professions throughout the state. So we may have materials like photographs or letters or artifacts that not only deal with UAMS, but also some of those items that have nothing whatsoever to do with UAMS. So a doctor might have graduated from Columbia University, for example, and we might have, but practiced here in Arkansas, so we may have some items from there. Speaking of items, we're always interested in adding to our collection. So if you have items that document an Arkansas doctor or another health professional in Arkansas, I'd love to speak with you. You can see the phone number on the screen and or the email. I'd love to hear from you and chat maybe about providing a donation to the Historical Research Center. As I mentioned earlier, this is the stay-at-home lecture series. It is sponsored by the Society for the History of Medicine and Health Professions, and it occurs, it's every Thursday, the first Thursday of every month from 7 to 8 p.m. And it is the link that you used to sign in today is the same link that you will use for next month's presentation and any presentation after that. Speaking of that, next month, I'll be the presenter next month, and we'll be talking about Dr. G. Thomas Jansen, who was on the dermatology faculty at UAMS, and we'll be talking about his career and his impact on the UAMS Department of Dermatology. That'll be on November 3rd, and so I hope you'll mark that in your calendars and plan on joining us. If you'd like, if you're already on the list for the emails, you'll get an invitation and you'll get an announcement about the presentation. If you're not, if you'd like, you can send an email to the email address I had on the previous screen, hrc@uams.edu, and ask to be put on the distribution list so you can get announcements of presentations and the annual dinner and so forth. And I also want to mention, just ask you to put on your calendar December 6th of this year. And on that date, we're going to be having a panel discussion on the history of the Little Rock Internal Medicine Clinic, which was the first integrated medical practice clinic in Arkansas. It was founded in 1970. We had hoped to do the 50th anniversary for our annual dinner, for the Society's annual dinner in 2020. That didn't happen, unfortunately, because of the pandemic. But we are going forward this year on December 6th and having a panel discussion about the clinic. And we have two of the original founders on the panel, Dr. Robert Moore and Dr. Hoyt Pyle. We'll also have Clarice Miller, who is the widow of the founder, Raymond Miller, and Dr. Joe Bates, whom many of you probably know, will be the moderator of that. It'll be from 4:30 to 6 p.m. It'll start with a reception, and then we'll have the panel discussion afterwards. And it'll be held in the hospital lobby gallery in the hospital. And so there'll be more details coming about that, and we'll be sending out invitations. So again, if you're interested in the panel discussion, just shoot me an email at that hrc@uams.edu, and I'll make sure that you get an invitation to that event. And just a couple of other things. This presentation and all of our presentations are recorded. They will, after the presentation tonight, I'll edit it a little bit, add a title screen, things like that, and then it'll be uploaded to the Society's YouTube channel. So if you want to see, rewatch this one tonight, or if you missed previous ones, you can go to the Society's YouTube channel, and all of the previous presentations are up online. Also, if you have a question, please feel free to use the chat box. You do not have to wait until the end of the presentation to write a question in the chat box. I'll be monitoring it, and we'll answer the questions though at the end of the presentation. And speaking of that, tonight I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Sam Taggart, who is a retired family practice physician. He practiced in Benton for a long time. He is a member of the Board of Trustees for the Society for the History of Medicine and Health Professions. He is an author. He's written a couple of fiction books. He's written a couple of nonfiction books, including a history of public health in Arkansas. And his most recent one is Country Doctors of Arkansas, which is oral history of doctors practicing in rural parts of Arkansas. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and he's going to be talking about, for every family, a family doctor, history of the modern family medicine movement in Arkansas. This title slide is wrong on that. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to ask Dr. Taggart to start his video if he's able to. There he is.
I'm muted.
You are not muted, Sam. We can hear you.
Okay.
And then if you'll go ahead and start your
hit share screen.
Share your screen.
Okay. And make sure I've got the right one here. All right, there we are.
We're going. Yeah, okay. and then just do the from beginning if you want to start your slideshow.
There we go.
Okay, and I'm going to turn off my video and audio, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Taggart.
Thank you very much, Tim. Thanks, folks, for inviting me. Y'all remember when you were a child, if you wanted credibility, you always say, well, my father always said, or my grandfather always said, or my mother always said. Well, now that I'm getting older and a little long in the tooth, I quote my oldest son and say, my son tells me to do this. And so my son's an anthropologist, and we're going to talk tonight about the history of who these people were, what problems they faced, what tools they had, and how they responded. The title for every family, a family doctor, is not my title. I wish I was. I wish I was smart enough to have thought that up, but it was created by a physician named Font Richardson from Fayetteville, who was the original editor for the newsletter for the Arkansas Academy of General Practice back in coined that in 1950. Okay, I've had the distinct privilege of, over the last 2 to 2.5 years, interviewing a lot of the people who are or were the institutional memory of the Arkansas Academy of Family Physicians. Dr. Emil Schutte, who's passed away, Dr. Schott Rogers, Dr. Lee Parker, who's passed away, Les Anderson, Bruce Schratz, Harold Hayes, a number, Linda McGee, a number of people, including Carla Coleman, who was the executive vice president of the organization for as long as many of us could remember. When we start trying to put the family physicians and the history of family physicians into a context, it's important to remember that the history of medicine in itself is the history of the generalist, going back multiple centuries. The oldest skeleton that is identifiable of a doctor is a 12,000-year-old female shaman physician from the Levant. And this was found back in the late 1990s and early 2000s. This was from National Geographic's. She was a female shaman, and I think that's real interesting that the very first was a female, and she had when you start to look back at who were the very first family doctors in Arkansas, we kind of know that. In the 1970s, Frank Sloan, who owned a farm on the Cache River over in East Arkansas, on a bluff. There was a bluff. They found a bunch of Indian artifacts. They called Dan Morris at the Archaeologic Survey at Jonesboro. They came out. They were able to identify this site as 10,500 years old, and it was the very first identifiable graveyard, formal graveyard in the Western Hemisphere, as far as anybody can tell. The interesting thing about that is most anthropologists will tell you that if they thought enough to bury their dead and they buried them in a formal way, then they were thinking about health and disease and illness. They probably had a shaman. They probably had somebody who dealt with them. And it was probably a woman, because they took care of the lame, the sick, the children, while the men were out hunting. So the first doctor in Arkansas, first family doctor in Arkansas, was probably a female Native American about 10,500 years ago. When Arkansas, the place that would become Arkansas, was purchased from the French, who stole it from the Spanish, who stole it from the French, who stole it from the Native Americans, there weren't any people here. There were probably 5,000 or 6,000 people, so there weren't any doctors. There were probably 3,000 to 4,000 Native Americans. There may have been as many as 400 Europeans and about 65 slaves. Very quickly, as people started moving in, they started having health problems. The people who provided the very first family care were granny doctors. Ella Dunn, as you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, is an example of a herbal doctor, a yarb doctor, Y-A-R-B. That was how they pronounced it up in the hills. That was one form of granny doctor. Another one is a little lady right in the middle. Okay, that's Dizzy Branscombe. She also is from up in the Ozarks. Dizzy Branscombe had 15 babies, and then she became a midwife. And somebody asked her, how she was qualified to be a midwife, and she said, "Well, hell, I had 15 kids." So that was Dizzy Branscombe's story. Over on the right-hand side of the screen is a different kind of granny doctor of a sort. Her name was Caroline Dye. She was from Jackson County, Arkansas, Newport, and she was a seer, a hoodoo doctor. She ministered primarily to the African-American population, but she was there forever and ever and ever. And she not only serviced the African-American population, she serviced the European population as well. As the population grew, doctors began to come into Arkansas. You'll see on the left-hand side of the screen, I have two books I have illustrated. One there is called Good Leaves from a Louisiana Swamp Doctor, and the other is Life and Adventure of an Arkansas Doctor. Arkansas spelled A-R-K-A-N-S-A-W. And These folks were often very young people. They came in, they preceptored with another doctor, and then once they had done enough of that, had done a little extra schooling, the doctor would say, now go somewhere else and set out your shingle. That was pretty well true throughout the 19th century. Towards the end of the 19th century, from about 1870 on, medical education became more formalized. And there were a number, there were 1,500 to 2,000 people who went by the name of physicians in Arkansas. In about 1906, a fellow named Walter Jacques came here for the Prudential Insurance Company to try to, they had a number of physicians on their panel who did physicals for them. And he was not impressed either with the physicians or with the health. And when he left, he went back to Chicago and he said, I don't even think we need to be writing insurance there. Another thing that happened right about that same time, reasonably unbiased, was Abraham Flexner. Abraham Flexner did the Flexner Report. Many of you are aware of that. The Flexner Report, the whole point of the Flexner Report was to decrease the number of medical schools in the United States, decrease the number of quacks, get the number of medical schools down to about 31, which they were able to do. Part of the problem with the Flexner Report, and also was to associate those medical schools those medical schools with universities. That had several unintended consequences. I don't think that was the original intention, but it did have some unintended consequences. One of those was that of the 7 medical schools that train African Americans in the United States, all but 2 of them went away. There were more women there. All the schools that allowed women in the medical schools went away with the exception of a very few. In fact, there were far more women practicing medicine in 1900 than there were in the United States, and there were in 1950. And the next thing that happened was the near demise of the generalist. Well, let me back up just a little bit on that. I'll come back to that bit about the generalist. The art and science of medicine, we've always heard that phrase, but the art and science of medicine, Dr. Francis Wheel Peabody of Harvard made the comment, and this is about 1918, that the secret of caring for patients is in the caring of the patient. The treatment of the disease must always be completely impersonal, but the treatment of the patient must always be completely personal. And what happened between the Flexner Report and the end of World War II was that technology became so prominent that it was crowding out the other parts of medicine. In the same time, the population of Arkansas was going through what world historians call a demographic transition. At the beginning of the 20th century, there were about 90% of the people lived on the farm or near the farm. By the end of the 20th century, 43 to 46% of the people lived on or near the farm. And during this demographic transition, people left Arkansas in droves. And this continued throughout the first half of the 20th century and in the first 20 years of the second half of the 20th century. The AMA, led by Morris Fishbein. Morris Fishbein was a pathologist who never practiced a day in his life, okay? Were determined to get rid of quacks. And no one would question that they did a fairly good job of that. And in fact, Morris Fishbein said at one time that Arkansas and California, by and afar, have more quacks and scoundrels in the medical profession than any place in the nation. And as time went on, they were able to, everybody knows the story of John R. Brinkley and what he did. But there were a couple of other things that happened. People like the fellow at Harvard and a number of other people began to look around and see that so much of medical education was focusing on technology that the art of medicine was going away. And by the end of World War II, James Coddington did a study of the hospital and health services in Arkansas, and they showed that there had been a substantial decline in the physician population in Arkansas, that there was a dramatic maldistribution, with two-thirds of the physicians in Arkansas carrying 1/3 of the population. And the physicians who were practicing general medicine and family practice were dramatically aging out, with a large percentage of them over the age of 45 to 50, which is 65 now. Right after World War II, and we're going to switch to the national picture here. Right after World War II, this was happening on all rural states in the United States and a lot of rural parts of the world, that people were just disappearing. There was a fellow in Oakland, California by the name of Stanley Truman. And Dr. Truman came home from the war and found out that he was going to be limited in his privileges because he had the name general practitioner behind his name. He pulled together an organization called the General Practice Association of Oakland, California. This was created in December 45, January of 46. Where they said, look, we think that it's important that we have family physicians, and he was saying general practice physicians. And one of the things that they required, and as far as I can tell, this was the very first time this had happened, they required, when they created their organization, they required that you have 100 hours of continuing education every 3 years. I believe that's the first time that a professional organization, medical or otherwise, required a significant amount of continuing medical education to stay certified and stay active in a professional organization. It took about 2 years for the American Academy of General Practice to get fully engaged. And by April 16th of 1948, a group of 22 physicians in Arkansas entered the fray. Among those groups were two men who were really, really important to the organization and are just wonderful examples for all of us. Dr. Font Richardson of Fayetteville and Dr. R.B. Robbins of Camden. Both of these men understood realpolitik. They understood that they would have to do negotiating to get what they needed. Okay, now think about this. And by the way, when the National Academy was formed, the National Academy required 150 hours as opposed to 100 hours every 3 years. But the question is, where do you get this continuing education? Where does this come from? The medical community, the general medical community, and not just general physicians, general practice physicians, but the general medical community had a rather touchy relationship with the University of Arkansas Medical Center, or the medical school. And there was conflict over the years. The deans, with the exception of Wissenhausen and one other, the deanship was kind of a revolving door. But there was a very happy, lucky convergence that happened in 1948 as the Arkansas Academy of General Practice was being formed. Sid McMath was elected governor. And Sid McMath, from the standpoint of family medicine, was really an important person. He ran, number one, on good roads. He ran on better schools, or improved roads, improved schools, and a new medical school. With a very, very conservative legislature, he was able to get pushed through a 2-cent a pack tax on cigarettes, okay, to build the new medical school. During his tenure, the medical school hired Hayden Nicholson. Hayden Nicholson was born and raised in rural Wisconsin, and he came in. Everybody says that he was this wonderful, delightful, smiling guy who said, we're going to do something about all these kinds of things. That particularly related to rural health, but family medicine and general medicine he went to the Arkansas Medical Society. He went to the new Arkansas General Practice Association. And he said, I want to do what I can to help. He even tried to start a residency a general practice residency program, and was turned down by the AMA. But so instead of that, what he started was a preceptorship program where medical students would go out and do a preceptorship with practicing physicians. And as far as I can tell, this was the very first formal preceptorship program. He got his preceptors from the Arkansas Academy of General Practice, mostly. And with the help of several men in the Arkansas Academy of General Practice, they began the continuing education program at the University of Arkansas Medical School. And they just ratcheted up the continuing medical education that was available every year throughout the 1950s. Hayden only stayed for, Dr. Nicholson only stayed for about 5 years, but it ratcheted up and ratcheted up. And then they began to step out and they began to go to locality, like to county medical societies and do meetings with the county medical societies for continuing education purposes. They did them all over the state. Most admirable. And this helped solidify this new and young Arkansas Academy of General Practice. That new academy had several issues that it had to try to find a way to improve. One was to increase the number of GPs in the state, and at the same time, obviously build the academy. To find a way to create continuing education credits, because at that point, coming by continuing education credits was very hard. I mean, the Southern Medical Association, the Arkansas Medical Society, a little bit, okay, and journals, and occasionally the county medical societies were the ones where you could get any continuing medical education. Font Richardson, who I showed you a picture of earlier, created the Academy newsletter to try to communicate. You understand that there were, at that point in time, in 1947-48, there were 23 counties in the state of Arkansas that did not have a paved road that connected it with any other county. There was no intrastate highway system, and Sid McMath did a lot about that. Again, they tried to create a general practice residency then. It did not happen then, but in the late 50s, they created another general practice residency. It was a 2-year residency, including the internship year plus 1 more year. And the medical center was not really behind this firmly, and it ultimately died, or at least it went dormant. I don't know if it ever died, but I think it just simply went dormant. You can't talk about the Arkansas, the modern family medicine movement in Arkansas without talking about a few really important people. For those of you who never got to meet Dr. Emil Schutte, the man in the upper left-hand corner, he's one of the most wonderful human beings I ever met. He's one of the hardest working men I ever met. I got to interview him just before he died, or a few months before he died. And he became the Family Doctor of the Year, National Family Doctor of the Year, I think in 1986. But he helped desegregate the medical staffs of the major hospitals in Little Rock in the early 1950s. Okay, Dr. Jim Weber in the right upper hand corner was also one of those people. He's a little bit later, but he came in. He was probably one of the finest politicians you will ever meet. Okay, he could schmooze with the absolute best of them. He spent every legislative session. He became the doctor of the day for the legislature. So when they needed to know something, they would go say, "Well, Dr. Webb, what do you think of what do you think about this program?" Dr. Tom Honeycutt was not a political person. Okay, Tom Honeycutt came along in the late to mid 50s, and he single-handedly at times kept the Arkansas Academy alive because he and his wife were the staff of the organization. He had an edge to him, but he kept it alive, and he worked extremely hard, and he was very proud of the work he did for that organization. In the mid-1960s, I'll go back and talk about this in a minute, but in the mid-1960s, there were 100 days that changed the face of family medicine in the United States. One was the Folsom Commission. Every person needs a personal physician. The Millis Report, and all these were independent studies. The Millis Report for the establishment of a primary care physician as the center of patient care and the development of family medicine residencies. And then the Willard Report, called for the establishment of a new specialty in medicine called the family physician. About 1970, things were moving. Things were really moving well. The family practice residency had become, at the University of Arkansas, had already begun. And a second lucky convergence happened. And that was the election of Dale Bumpers, the appointment of Dean Winston Shorey at the Medical Center, Chancellor James Dennis, the vice president, Dennis was the chancellor and vice president. And then after those two came Tom Bruce. Those men looked around and said, we're still not making the progress that we need to be making to get physicians to the patients in this rural state. Medicare and Medicaid and health insurance and private health insurance had already taken off, and there was a lot of people who needed a physician who could not get one. Okay, the Academy of Family Physicians had been created. Board certification had been done. The first test had been done. By the way, the very first test that they did nationally for board certification in 1970, 2,800 people took it. 81% of the people passed it. And of the people who had been out of school less than 20 years, 95% passed it. Okay. But the thing that these guys did that was the most important, that really had a big problem, was what Dr. Dennis or Mr. Dennis called a school without walls. They knew very well that physicians go where they are trained. If they're trained in an area, they're allowed to stay there. Okay, and so they created the AHAC program. And in the early 1970s, after the family medicine program was started at UMS, they created AHAC programs, Area Health Education Centers, and they had them in Pine Bluff, Fort Smith, Fayetteville, El Dorado, Texarkana, Jonesboro, areas where these kids could be, these young medical graduates could be trained in family medicine. And this has been one of those programs. You know, there's any number of programs that are started by these large organizations, but the AHAC programs have worked remarkably well. They produced an awful lot of the physicians who are out there practicing family medicine in the state right now. By 1980, we were in a new time. Medicare had been passed, and it was essentially an open spigot. Okay, they didn't put any guidelines on how you're going to keep from spending every penny this nation could ever make. And so by the 1980s, there were a number of issues that had to be dealt with, one of which was cost containment. We have another generation of people who were exquisitely important to the development of family medicine in Arkansas. Joe Stallings was head of the AHAC program up in Jonesboro, wonderful guy. Mike Moody was one of those political characters who was out there, and he was all around the state all the time, talking to physicians, talking to the powers that be. Linda McGee taught in the Fayetteville program. I can't see his because of my little shadow up here, but in the right hand up in corner is Dr. Charles Rogers, Dr. Shot Charles Rogers. By the way, he got the nickname Shot because he said when I was a kid I was a hot shot. Okay, he's another one. He and Jim Weber were responsible for the political solidification of the Arkansas Academy of Family Physicians, Arkansas General Practice. By the way, the Academy changed its name in 1971 from the Arkansas Academy of General Practice to the Arkansas Academy of Family Physicians. Another one of those people who is just an absolute, or actually the two people in the corners of this picture, Dr. Bruce Schrautz from North Little Rock, and then Dr. Les Anderson from Lonoke. Dr. Anderson was the other physician who was named National Family Physician of the Year, and obviously from Arkansas. Wonderful guy, has acted as a mentor for many, many, many students. This new age, 1980 to 2000, brought cost containment. And of course, cost containment was obviously a real problem for everybody, because everybody got used to just making a charge and that was what was paid. Well, that stopped in the 1980s, 1990s, and it's still ongoing now. Privileges became a real problem at this point. In the 1950s, 30% of all general abdominal surgery in the United States was done by general practice physicians. And from the 1960s on, there has been a conflict between surgical privileges and OB privileges. As late as the 1990s, more than 50% of the babies in Arkansas were continued to be delivered by primary care physicians and not by obstetricians, just because there weren't that many. Technology and corporatization of medicine had a big, big, big impact in the 1980 to the 2000 timeframe. Family physicians in the 1950s, usually one guy, maybe two guys in an office, and might have been a father and son or a father and daughter. And the cost of equipping an office just started going up and up and up and up. So by the end of the 20th century, large groups and then corporatization of medicine. There are two different kinds of corporatization of medicine that have had an impact in Arkansas. One is Baptist Hospital, St. Vincent's Hospital, Mercy Hospital, Cooper Clinic, larger concerns, larger tertiary care hospitals, buying up practices in small towns or buying up practices in large towns. And then there is the corporatization of medicine that is like our care, what Steve Collier does through our care, where they identify underserved counties that the large corporate structures don't want to go into, and they go in and find a way to provide services for these patients. And that has done an awful lot in the last few years. Not just Steve, but East Arkansas Family Health, Cabin Services down in that's CABUN down in South Arkansas, and there's two or three others. I'm going to skip slide. I'm going to come back to this one in just a minute. There are a couple of guys in the National Academy who were really wonderful people, and they did a great deal. G. Gale Stevens was born in rural western Missouri, ended up going to Kansas City, going to Kansas, helped start the family medicine residency there in Kansas, and then went to University of Alabama and helped start their program. This is back in the early 1970s. But he became the poet laureate of the American Academy of Family Physicians. He was a thinker, and he writes beautifully. If you find anything written by him, I would encourage you to read it. The Intellectual Basis for Family Medicine is a wonderful book that he wrote back in the 80s. Well, he created a number of conferences that were called the Keystone Conferences. And Keystone 3 happened as a result of the CHASM report that was put out by the Institute of Medicine that in 2001 that said that medicine was broken, that medicine in the United States was broken, that we paid twice as much for our care and got less verifiable results because of it. And their thought was that it needs, because you need a primary care based physician at the center of the care, and the primary care based physicians had been pushed to the side. In 2002, Keystone 3, they created the Future of Family Medicine. And the Future of Family Medicine came up with a number of things that have been really very important. And as y'all know, as I assume there's some historians in the audience, but when you start trying to write history about things that haven't been worked out yet, you really don't know. Most of the things that they proposed back then have not been fully worked out, but some of the things that they proposed include electronic medical records. And I will tell you that in 2005, 2006, when you said electronic medical records, to the vast majority of the medical community, they ran. Okay, but electronic medical records have now taken over. There are some good things and there are some bad things about electronic medical records. It's easy to just type this stuff in and not have a meaningful record. Another of the things that is taking hold, but it's a very slow thing to take hold, is called the patient care medical home. This concept started in about 1967 in pediatrics, dealing with chronically ill children. And the interesting thing was that it was finally picked up, and in Affordable Care Act back during the Obama years, there was a lot of money put into the idea of creating a patient-centered medical home, meaning that a patient, instead of going to a dozen different places to get their information, that all of their information could be stored in one place, and it would be restructured to fit that. That has been slow to come about, but it may be coming about in the next few years. Telemedicine. Telemedicine is a interesting process that has been used in family medicine, and there were a lot of physicians in family medicine who felt like that telemedicine could be antibiotic and pain medicine vending machines. And I'm sure that in some cases that may be true. But COVID pushed the system to be more inclusive with telemedicine. And some of the most recent studies have shown that telemedicine can be a very effective tool if it's done with established patients. That's my take on that issue. I suspect that we're going to see a lot of information written about the use of telemedicine in chronic disease and with existing patients. But there's a caveat to that. It needs to be that. Nobody knows what to do about mid-level providers. And now I don't want to offend anybody, but there have been different ways of looking at the whole idea of nurse practitioners and physician's assistants. The die is cast now. Their scope of practice laws have passed, so they're practicing, and they will be practicing as independent providers. But if you go out into the state and you talk to Steve Collier and ARCare, if you talk to the folks at East Arkansas Family Health, they say they couldn't exist if they didn't have physician's assistants and nurse practitioners. So you've got both of these sides of the issues, and then there are some who are just absolutely, completely opposed. Now, throwing this little slide in just to show you that the Arkansas Academy of Family Physicians is growing. It's been a healthy organization for years and years. I think it's going to continue to grow. As long as there are families out there, there are going to be family physicians. Okay, I'm throwing this in as a little bit of advertisement. Part of what I'm doing here is I've written a book called For Every Family, a Family Doctor, and it will be out in January. We hope. Okay, but if you get a chance, I'll pick up a copy of it sometime. And that's my full remarks. Thank you very much. Tim, you can have it back.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. and always a good presentation. Appreciate you having me here. Just want to remind people, if you have a question, please use the chat feature and type in your question in the chat box. Sam, if you'll stop sharing your screen, our videos will become larger.
Okay. So, okay, done.
Yep, you're good. I have a question. The National Academy of Family Physicians, which was originally known as, was it the Academy of General Practitioners?
Yes.
It was founded.
Right.
That was founded in 1947, correct?
Yeah, well, yeah, 47, right.
What was the impetus to, do you know what the impetus was to form that organization in 1947? And then I'm assuming that the Arkansas chapter formed pretty much at the same time.
Yeah. Well, what was happening was all of these family doctors or general practitioners who had been in World War II were coming back and finding out that their privileges were being dramatically restricted, that there were fewer and fewer people going into fewer and fewer general practitioners. And so they said, well, let's do something about it. That's where Stanley Truman created the Oakland organization. He then went and talked to the general practice section of the AMA at a meeting in San Francisco, and they said, well, let's do something about that. And they started that organization. And then less than a year later is when Font Richardson and and Dr. Robbins from Camden walked into a meeting of 22 family physicians, or excuse me, general practitioners in the Marion Hotel with a fully developed constitution, a fully developed set of bylaws, and said, we want to form this organization. And they said unanimously, yes, let's do it. So the question is, where did that come from? I guarantee you I know where it came from, even though I can't find it written down anywhere. It came from the National Academy. Okay, that's where it came from. Yeah.
Did the Academy founded in 1947, did it have an active role in, say, fighting polio in the 1950s, and having these sort of vaccination pushes in Arkansas? Were they actively involved in that, or were they?
If you look at, yeah, they got involved in everything they could possibly get themselves involved in. If you look at all of the physicians who were involved in the polio, the Salk and Saving Sundays and all that kind of stuff, it's the same people. It was the same people, okay? And it was, they were out there. They were out there doing all of that stuff, but they were doing this well before the Academy formed.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? They were doing this as a part of the Arkansas Medical Society before, and then they just switched over. They didn't switch their allegiances, but they started working hard on it. Yeah, that's right. Mm-hmm. One other guy we didn't mention, and he wasn't part of the Arkansas Academy, but you can't talk about polio and all those kinds of things without talking about the leadership of Roger Boast. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. You cannot talk about that without the leadership of somebody like Roger Boast, who was a pediatrician in Fort Smith. And he was a great guy.
This is a little bit sort of off topic, different direction than what I just asked you. What about the Arkansas chapter, the Academy? Do you know when they integrated, and when then, I'm assuming in 1947, they did not allow
1954.
1954, that's when they allowed
Oberwhite, Dr. Morris Jackson, mm-hmm. Dr. Oberwhite, okay, were both, and there is in your research facility, you have an interview that Emil Schutte that I told you about earlier, okay? Mm-hmm. Emil Schutte did with Dr. Oberwhite, okay, and they talk about the integration of the medical societies and the, mm-hmm. and the hospital staffs. The hospital staffs were the biggest deal. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That was the biggest deal.
Mm-hmm. Does anybody have? Go ahead, Sam. I'm sorry, I interrupted.
No, I was just going to say, I'm just so proud to have known Dr. Emil Schutte. Mm-hmm. He was just a great person, great human being.
there have been really big giants in the Arkansas medical field and throughout our history. I mean, you mentioned Font Richardson up in Fayetteville and Dr. Boast, and I believe he was over in Fort Smith.
Yeah, he did Fort Smith before he came to
yeah, but there are all these giants in the medical field in Arkansas who made such an impact.
And Tom Bruce.
Tom Bruce, yeah.
I just kind of almost passed over Tom Bruce. Tom Bruce is just, I mean, just great.
Mm-hmm. And they're coming together in the 1950s with Governor McMath to support the new medical center. They just made so many contributions to Arkansas medical history.
Sid McMath was a magnificent politician.
Mm-hmm.
He could get a 2-cent per pack tax on tobacco passed. Okay. and the roads and he was saying but he wasn't just saying all the right things, he was doing all the right things.
Mm-hmm.
And he had backing of these people in this academy who were, I mean, they weren't scared to work. They worked very hard.
I found it interesting that they used the sales tax on cigarettes in the 50s to fund the medical center, and then years later in the late 90s or early 2000s, they used the tobacco settlement money to fund the College of Public Health at UAMS. So I always think that's appropriate.
Right.
And of course, Tom Bruce was heavily involved in the founding of the College of Public Health.
Do you know the story? I've got a cute story about Tom Bruce, if you want to hear it real quick.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Tom Bruce was a concert pianist. Okay. He was an excellent pianist. I don't know if he ever became he was a very accomplished pianist. He was in high school. He went to the University of Arkansas to try out to be in their music program. And this lady, he described it because I interviewed him a couple of years ago before he died. This lady interviewed him, listened to him play. You sound very nice, Mr. Bruce. We'll get back with you. Okay. And so he goes home, doesn't ever hear about it, anything. Okay. And so he didn't hear anything at all from the university. And he goes to medical school, goes to college, goes to medical school, becomes an international rural health expert, becomes the dean of the school, dean of that school, dean of that. Fast forward 40 years, his mother passes away. Okay. And he goes to her house to clean out her house. And as he's going through her things, he finds a letter from the music program at Fayetteville, which had accepted him into the music program, and she had not ever let him have it.
She wanted him to be a doctor.
She wanted to be a doctor. And that's straight from him. That's straight from him.
Well, thank goodness he went into medicine. I mean, he would have been a great pianist, and he would have had an impact on the music world as well. But thank goodness he went into the medical field. Right. So, any questions before we wind up for tonight? Doesn't look like we have any questions, Sam. I think you answered everyone's questions in your presentation.
Well, thank you. Appreciate it.
Before we. You're still the Country Doctors of Arkansas book. That's still available, right? If people want to get a copy of it,
absolutely. Buy many copies.
And it's available probably at all the bookstores.
It's mainly can you give them my email address? It's samtaggart@att.net. Okay. Anyway, what I was going to say is the book is available through the Arkansas Times website.
Okay.
And they have a Shopify. They have a Shopify site where you can purchase it. I'm still out there promoting this book, and I am having more fun doing this. By the way, and Miss Annette and I, my wife and I, are beginning the work on another book. Okay, that we hope to have done in a year and a half or 2 years, and it's going to be called Against the Odds, and we're going to co-author this one, and it's going to be Arkansas Women in Medicine Before 1972.
Oh wow. Yeah, that's going to be an interesting book.
Oh, I think it'll be fascinating. It's going to be just as much fun as the family practice and the country medicine doc. Yeah, it's going to be it's a lot. So there were some really, really powerful people out there practicing medicine.
Mm-hmm. Now you said your new book, For Every Family, a Family Doctor, that's coming out in January.
Yeah.
And you'll be going on the road to promote that?
I'm sure I will be.
Well, we'll have you back next year to talk a little bit about that then.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much for being here. We really
Thank you.
appreciate it.
Thank you. All right.
And thanks everyone else for being here tonight. Hopefully you'll join us in November for the presentation on Dr. Jansen and the dermatology